If you go out and you go looking in the world, or in our country especially today, you'll find this appearance that there is some kind of fight between science and faith. That science and faith cannot agree with one another. They are at odds with one another. And if you need evidence that that is the case, I'm about to give you some. I did a quick Google search for literally just for the phrase science and faith. And here are 5 of the first images that came up when I searched for science and faith. So we've got some signposts, right? Faith that way, reason that way. Whoa.
So sorry.
No, you're all right. Come on in.
Familiar.
All right, not the same direction, 2 opposite directions. This one is particularly ridiculous. I did enjoy it. They have put arms with boxing gloves on a microscope and a cross. So they're going to fight each other, I guess, right here. This was right, arm wrestling. This is right, it's in conflict. Here's another one, right? It's like you have to choose. You can go that way with faith or that way with science, but opposite directions. And then this one, I don't know, we're weighing. We're going to try and figure out. This one's maybe the least offensive. I say, which one is like right, as if one has to be right and one has to be wrong. They are balanced at the moment, yeah? Yes, maybe that's okay. I got one more. This one I saved to add on. This is my absolute favorite absurd creation. Yeah, that's, someone spent some time on that. It appears to be Einstein and Jesus arm wrestling. Although, if you notice, it does appear, I think Jesus has some earbuds in, and has like a tablet down here. He's got the Bible app, I assume. I don't know. But anyway,
Go ahead.
this is what we find, right? This is what we find a lot of out in the world and in the media today, is that science and faith are at odds with one another. But there is hope. This proposition that science and faith are opposed to one another is a lie. I believe that strongly, and I will try and convince you of that tonight as well. And it's a lie that makes me, as I say, equal parts sad and angry. It makes me sad because the truth that I know is that science and faith are beautiful, complementary pursuits. And so it makes me sad when it's portrayed that they are not things that can work together. And it makes me angry at whoever is saying that. There's a little bit of anger. I don't know, maybe it's righteous anger. There's such thing as righteous anger, right? Is it okay? Yeah. Maybe this one's okay. I don't know. It depends on how angry I get at the actual individual person. But it does, if I'm being honest. It makes me sad. It makes me angry. There are some arenas where this lie has already been dismantled. And this is one of the first things I want to present to you is a little bit of good news. Because I will say that in my time in academia, which spans, a decade and a half, almost 2 decades at this point, I've actually not encountered this very much. In my particular fields, in physics and astronomy, I don't find this even from secular atheist colleagues in my departments. There isn't really this impression that science and faith are at odds with one another, at least in the physics and astronomy community that I've been exposed to. And this is maybe a little piece of good news, right? That this is not actually universal. It's not that everyone out there believes that you can either be someone who believes in science or be a person of faith, but there's no way you could be both. So there are areas where it's already been dismantled, but there are many places where this lie does persist. And yet there is reason for hope. I find hope in my own experiences. I'm dealing with this topic like I just said. So my experience moving through, college I can't really count, right? I was at Westmont College. It was a Christian college. And so there, everyone knew that your studies and your faith could be integrated because everyone was on board with that same premise. But even through grad school and through my first job working at Creighton University out in Omaha, Nebraska, and my second job here at California State University, Sacramento, it's been my experience that you will find people of faith in science departments. You will find lots of people who are not people of faith in science departments, but that each understands that the other is presumably doing their very best to determine what is true, what they can rely on, and that it is not a situation where you would have to be an idiot to believe one way or the other. Ultimately, I find my true hope in the promises of Scripture, that eventually a day will come when every knee will bow and every tongue confess, and I look forward to that day, but that day is not here yet. So in the here and now, what can we do, what do we see, and what's going on? So let's go ahead and take a look at some ways to try and dismantle this false claim that science and faith are at odds. And one of the most common ways this is initially presented is this idea that you'd have to be an idiot to be a Christian. Right? That you'd have to be some kind of person with no brain to believe these things that Christians believe. And that, luckily, is actually maybe the easiest thing to refute. Because all you need are some counterexamples. Right? In order to disprove you'd have to be an idiot to be a Christian, all you need to do is find a smart Christian. And that's not that hard. And we can look historically and find some brilliant people of faith. And so this is by no means an exhaustive list, but here's just 3 people that came to my mind. Blaise Pascal was a famous 17th century French mathematician, physicist, philosopher, theologian, developed some amazing theories within mathematics, made great breakthroughs. The famous Pascal's wager is actually a weird combination of like probability, game theory, and the existence of God. He was a very devout religious believer, but also a pioneering scientist and mathematician. Robert Boyle, arguably the father of chemistry, almost certainly the first modern chemist who made huge breakthroughs in the fields of chemistry and the studies of gases and liquids, and also a very devout believer. Also 17th century, I believe, if memory serves correct. Georges Lemaître, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, he was Belgian. And this is moving a little bit more recent, early 1900s, was a Belgian priest who was also an astrophysicist and mathematician and theoretical physicist. And many people consider to actually be kind of like the father of the Big Bang Theory. So huge breakthroughs come from the work of Father Lemaître, Belgian priest and scientist. Now, if you present a list like this to someone who was making that claim, you'd have to be an idiot to be a Christian. They might counter with, well, yeah, but everyone back in the olden days was religious. There weren't, atheism wasn't really an acceptable option if you go back in time far enough. Well, first of all, that's not entirely true, but it is admittedly true that religious belief was much more widespread in the olden days. But these individuals weren't just, these 3 I pictured, they weren't just passive believers who were doing what everyone else seemed to be doing. They were adamant, ardent, passionate believers who devoted as much time to their spiritual pursuits and theology as they did to their scientific studies. But also, fine, if you're going to be a troublemaker, I can go much more modern as well. Right? We can move into contemporary scientists. Deborah Haarsma is a PhD astrophysicist with degrees from MIT and is the current president of BioLogos, an organization of Christian scientists devoted deeply to her faith, but also to studying galaxies beyond the Milky Way. Brother Guy, and again I'm going to torture this last name, Consolmagno. Brother Guy is an American astronomer. He has 2 degrees from MIT and a PhD in planetary sciences. And after having worked in those fields for years, he actually took his vows and became a Jesuit monk. He is now Brother Guy, and he eventually actually worked his way up. He is the head of the Vatican Observatory. Actually, Brother Guy has another nickname. He's known as the Pope's astronomer. Francis Collins, fantastic name. Francis Collins has probably, I shouldn't try to rank them, but out of this list, one of the most impressive scientific resumes. Francis Collins was the head of the Human Genome Project back a couple decades ago now. That was the first attempt to actually map out the entire genetic code of a human being, and succeeded. And Francis Collins was the head of that project. The success of that and kind of the work he put on that continued to move him higher and higher up, and he may still be, I think he might have stepped down, was the head of NIH, the National Institutes of Health, right? Kind of like the premier organization of medicine and health in the United States, and he was the head of the NIH. He also was the founding president of BioLogos. Deborah Haarsma is the current president of BioLogos, but Francis Collins is the one who started BioLogos, this organization of Christians in the sciences. One thing I didn't include there on the bullet point, he wrote a fantastic book called The Language of God, which to him is a metaphor for DNA. Is that you're holding it? I love it. There's a copy of it right there. That's what the cover looks like. And this idea that, in his studies of genetics, he saw in the genetic code the language of God. The letters, right, that God used. Well, we call them letters, G, C, A, T. But the chemicals, the atoms that God used to create the amazing diversity of life on this planet and the amazing complexity of our own bodies. And then John Polkinghorne, wildly successful career in theoretical physics. He's done all kinds of things, or did all kinds of things, passed away a couple years ago. But just an amazing successful career in physics. And then after decades in the field, went and became an Anglican priest. And he had always, his faith had always been important to him, and he had incorporated science and faith. And he had such a successful career that, I don't know if this is exactly what was going through his head, but he's like, well, I basically did all the physics I need to do for several lifetimes. Now I'll go devote myself primarily to my other pursuits, spiritual pursuits. So there are, the point of this, right, there are plenty of brilliant, accomplished, talented scientists who are also devout people of faith. So if anyone ever tries to say, like, well, you can't really be a Christian, you trust science. Yes, you can. Right? And I could add to this list of, accomplished Christian academics, other colleagues of mine that I know. Right? And Anne even hinted at, that maybe you'll have some other Sac State professors up here. Russell D. Silvestro from Fremont Presbyterian Church is also the chair of the philosophy department at Sac State, a very accomplished philosopher with many, many publications under his belt, and a devout man of faith. So you don't have to look far to disprove this silly claim that you can't be smart and also be a Christian. So, all right, that was easy enough. What about disproving God? I think there is maybe a notion among some people today, you might hear it said, that like science has basically gotten to the point where we've disproven God, right? Friedrich Nietzsche said God is dead. And that is not the case, right? And we had an easy time. That was funny. I don't really need my laser pointer on, and it bounced right off and hit the ceiling. There's some science happening. It's reflection. It's pretty easy to disprove this idea that you can't be smart and be a Christian, or be a scientist and be a Christian. But hasn't modern science basically disproven God? And the answer to that is an emphatic no with an exclamation point. Definitely not. No, modern science has not disproven God. Before we get too excited, let me be clear, we also haven't proven God. As much as maybe we would like that. There certainly have been throughout history people who have attempted to prove the existence of God. I would say that no one has ever really succeeded in doing that. So there's not really a proof one way or the other. Can you prove God? I don't think anyone ever has. I don't think anyone probably ever will. Not before Christ comes back. And I think that's God's intention, right? I mean, all of creation is under his sovereignty. So if that's the way it is, that's presumably the way he wanted it to be. That there is an element of faith that remains, right? Faith is a required component of our life as Christians. That we are not given such overwhelming, complete, thorough evidence that there's actually no room for doubt or decision. That there is this wiggle room where we have to decide. Now that being said, let me be clear, and I like the way that, I can't remember now who first said this, but that our faith is not a blind faith, though. It's not that we believe with absolutely no reason. We may not have proof that God exists, but we certainly have evidence. And there's a distinction to be made between proof and evidence, right? So we can't prove that God exists, but we certainly have evidence that God exists. Evidence is something that we do have available to us. So, proof versus evidence. Well, this is, again, let's bring science back into this. Because many of the incredible breakthroughs of modern science of the last 50 to 100 years actually, I would say, strengthen the Christian understanding of the universe. And there are a few that I want to touch on here. The very first one, I mentioned George Lemaitre earlier. The idea of Big Bang cosmology itself is actually quite helpful to a Christian who wants to reconcile science with their faith. So let me really quick just turn back the clock 150 years. If we go back in time 150 years, there was a general agreement, a consensus among astrophysicists and astronomers about how the universe works. And we looked out into the universe and we saw that year after year and even century after century, it looked pretty much the same. And so scientists assumed that the universe was currently the way it had always been and always was, and that it had existed forever. This was called the steady state hypothesis. Steady state, that things aren't changing. It's a nice steady universe. The universe has been around forever, it had no beginning, and it's always looked the same. And then in the early 1900s, this started to come into a little bit of doubt, and there were a lot of debates about whether or not the universe actually may have had a beginning. And scientists are now exceedingly confident that our universe did in fact have a beginning, right? What we often refer to now as the Big Bang. The word cosmology, by the way, a lot of fun. This actually just came up in my astronomy class today. Not the same as cosmetology. Those are two different words, right? Cosmology is the study of the origins of the universe. So Big Bang cosmology is to study the very, very beginning of the universe. And the scientific consensus today is that our universe did have a beginning, which agrees pretty well with what we read in the opening chapters of Genesis. And it was not something that had been assumed for a long time. It was actually the opposite of what scientists thought. But a breakthrough brought us closer to, I would say, agreement with what Christians had believed for a long time. This next one, the fine-tuning problem, this one is also very interesting. The more that we study the universe we live in, the more we find that it seems to be just perfectly set up for life to exist, and that it does not have to be that way. There are a myriad of physical constants that help define the universe. Things like the speed of light, right, which determines how fast light travels. Things like the gravitational constant, which determines how strong gravity is and how much objects are pulled together or towards one another. The electrical constant, which determines how much charges repel and attract one another. And these constants presumably could have had like any value. But if they had almost any other value than the value that they do have, there is no way that life would be possible in our universe. If you crank up the electrical constant a bit too much, then atoms become much, much smaller. And you can't actually construct molecules out of them successfully. All you would have was like individual atoms floating around, and you could never build molecules or complex compounds. If you turn up the gravitational constant a little bit, gravity gets too strong, and stars aren't able to form. Instead of stars, you get just black holes. You get an entire universe made of just black holes. And spoiler alert, no one's living in that universe. If you turn the gravitational constant up a little bit more, you don't even get black holes. You just never get particles to form in the first place. Our universe seems to be perfectly fine-tuned to allow the existence of life, to allow for stars and planets and water vapor and human beings. And out of the billions and billions and trillions and trillions and quadrillions of possible ways the universe could have been, that it ends up being this one particular way is admittedly not proof that God exists, but it is very suspicious. And this is the distinction between evidence and proof, right? It's not proof, because you could always fall back on, well, it's unlikely, but unlikely things can happen. That's true, unlikely things can happen. But at some point, right, you buy 3 lottery tickets and they all win 3 times in a row, you're thinking there might be something weird going on with the lottery. You're just really, really lucky. This last one, I like the beauty of it. It's a little bit, maybe you might say a little bit less scientific, a little bit more abstract, but the elegance of the laws of nature is in many ways, I think, evidence for a creator. The fact that there even exists laws in the first place, I think I'll get to that on the next slide, is interesting. But the fact that the laws, the mathematical laws that govern our universe, they are beautiful, or at least I think they are. I know a lot of people will never look at math and see beauty. You're missing out, I tell you. You're missing out. But the elegance of the laws that govern our universe is interesting and not necessarily to be expected, right? Like many people, probably a lot of you in this room, not big fans of math, not excited to encounter math at some point in your life, not interested in looking at equations, because equations often can be big, terrible, horrible, ugly things, and working through them can take pages and pages and pages of work. And yet, the equations that govern our universe tend to have a beautiful elegance, a simplicity, and a cohesion. The law of gravity that explains why Earth orbits the sun actually looks almost identical to Coulomb's law that explains why an electron orbits a single atom. The composure of them is almost identical, just changing mass for charge, changing one constant for another. Right? Newton's second law governs basically all motion here on Earth, and it's very simple. F equals ma. It's only 3 letters. Right? The elegance of the laws that govern our universe is again, certainly not proof, but it's very interesting. It's very suspicious, you might say, right? It seems to me to be evidence for an intelligent, creative mind that built these laws in the first place. It's not proof. It's not. I'm not going to say it is. But it is evidence. There are observations from other fields beyond the sciences, beyond the natural sciences, that also help us as Christians in this kind of pursuit of academics and pursuit of our spiritual life. The existence, I think most human beings would agree, of a universal morality, that there are things, there are acts that everyone would agree are wrong, or everyone would agree are right. And there's not really much of any way to get at this without a creator, without a God who has determined that morality. This is one of the, in my opinion, one of the leading problems for any responsible atheist to overcome, is the almost universal human agreement that there are certain things that are wrong, right? Like torturing a child. That's not okay. But why? Why is it not okay? If all you have to fall back on is evolutionary theory and the mechanistic progression of the cosmos, there isn't actually a good reason you can give for why that is truly morally wrong. And yet even most staunch atheists, I think, would agree that it is in fact wrong, even if they can't give you a good reason for why it is. The existence of universal morality is another thing that seems to suggest a creator who is above us, who has instilled those values into the universe. And this last one, the quest for God, I'm going to attribute Lewis, with C.S. Lewis being one of the first ones to expose me to this idea, though I'm sure there was people who even predated Lewis. But the fact that as we look around the world, basically every civilization has created some kind of religion or spirituality. We are always yearning for God. Why? Probably because that's the way we were made, right? And C.S. Lewis says hungers that exist in the human body tend to represent something that is actually to be fulfilled, right? And the literal stomach hunger is because you are supposed to eat. Thirst is because you are supposed to drink, right? The desire for breath is because we are supposed to breathe. The desire for, right, like copulation is because we are supposed to breathe and breed. The desire for God presupposes the existence of a God to be desired. The fact that we have a God-shaped hole in our hearts, as some might say, is strong evidence that there is a God designed to fill that hole. I shouldn't say designed. We were designed with that hole so that we might seek God to be fulfilled. So the kind of innate human quest for God is, again, not proof. Right? If you really want to stick to your guns, right, a staunch atheist could say that is just some fault of our human programming, that we create God when he doesn't exist. But I think it's more likely that it's the other way around. Yeah?
When you put up there the elegance of the laws of nature, I immediately thought of pine cones in the pine cones, and then also flower buds, again, that perfect circle and perfect, I mean, that's...
Yeah, so you're going, yeah, we can go beyond the laws to nature itself, right? Nature is beautiful. There's a really interesting quote, and that made me think of this, and this is interesting because this is actually from a non-Christian. Richard Feynman is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And he was once asked, does your study of science detract from your ability to appreciate the beauty of nature? And he said, absolutely no. By learning more about, for example, the genetics behind a flower and why it has a certain number of petals and a certain arrangement, it doesn't detract from my appreciation of that aspect of nature, it enhances it. I appreciate this beauty all the more by understanding why it ends up doing what it does. And so I think, but we can look, I'm up here as the huge nerd talking about the equations. When you can go out and gaze upon a sunset, right, or a pine cone, or a flower, or an animal, right, a bird flying through the air, the ways in which God's creation fulfills the things that they need to do in these beautiful and often elegant ways. And we can see it out in nature as well as in the abstract layer underneath that describes nature. It's beautiful, good point. So let's keep going. I hinted at this, and I want to talk about this now. Another piece of evidence is that we have order and not chaos in this universe. I was talking about the elegance of the laws of physics, but actually the fact that there are laws of physics at all is evidence. This is getting a little higher level of metaphysics type stuff, but there's no reason this universe had to have laws that cause it to behave in an orderly fashion. There's not a reason the universe has to have that as a part of it. We could have lived in a universe that's just totally chaotic. and that your experiences in the past have no influence on how things are going to happen in the future. But that is not the universe we live in. We live in a universe that does have orderly laws that are obeyed by the natural elements of the universe. The fact that science even exists in the first place relies upon this. If the exact same event proceeded in wildly different ways, time after time, then science would be pretty worthless. Because observing something and seeing how it works doesn't actually help you figure out how it's going to work next time. The existence of science owes itself to the existence of laws of nature that can be trusted to repeat themselves and act in an orderly fashion. It's a fantastic quote. And you'll actually, for what it's worth, you'll see this Einstein quote. Actually, let me say two things. For what it's worth, if you find an Einstein quote somewhere, there's about a 30% chance that it was actually said by Einstein. All kinds of stuff just gets attributed to him. This particular quote you might see with slightly different wording because it actually wasn't originally in English. It was in Einstein's native German. But it can be translated in English a couple different ways. But something like this. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Right? Classic Einstein wit. But the idea that we actually are able to explore and understand the universe is wild, because there's no reason it had to be that way. And it's wonderful, I think, that it is that way. And again, not proof, but I think certainly evidence that it was created that way on purpose, that it was set up in a way that it is understandable, right? It's not, right? So Einstein's quote that it's incomprehensible, I think is a little bit less incomprehensible if you believe, as I do, that there was an omnipotent creator who made this universe and who specifically delights in our sometimes feeble attempts to understand the universe that he gave us, the universe that he put us in, right? God is a creator, and we are made in the image of God. And so that creativity that he displayed in making the universe is something that we are to emulate. And we should do our best to try and understand this universe he put us in. It's not always easy, and we don't always get it right, but it is, at least for me, a lot of fun. And it's a wonderful way to spend time. Okay, it's been a lot of good news so far. Now it's time for a slightly more depressing slide. Problems do exist. I think I'd be doing you all a disservice if I ignored two large areas within the sciences where there is some dissonance between consensus scientific theory and, I'll say, some people of faith. And there's an interesting little point to make here on the uniqueness of the country that we live in. But this is maybe like the elephant in the room. You might have guessed. I'm talking about the age of the universe and evolution. And this is some heady waters to head into. And so before I head into the direction we're going, I would like for a moment for us to remember the motto of the EPC to which we belong, because it is fantastic. I love the EPC motto. And it is this: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. Do you guys know that? I don't know if you knew that, but it's so good. I think this is fantastic for a lot of reasons, but I think it's a great set of principles for a Christian to live their life by. In essentials, unity. In the facts that are essential to our faith, we need to have unity. We need to be in agreement, right? In order for us to embrace someone as a brother or sister in Christ, there are certain things that are non-negotiable, right? If you think that Jesus wasn't actually the Son of God, he was just like a pretty good guy, and he had some good things that he taught, I'm sorry, that's not really going to fly. We're going to need to have some corrective conversations there. Right? There are things that are essential, and in those things we need to be unified and in agreement. But in non-essentials, liberty. In non-essential, there is some freedom of choice, right? And here I'm thinking about things like, like infant baptism. Some Christians think that's okay. Some Christians don't. I don't think that makes you not a Christian if you land on one side or the other of whether or not you should baptize infants, right? That would be an example of a non-essential, and there's some room for leeway there, right? Another one is, it gets, I don't want to go this direction, but it gets tricky to kind of figure out what to do with some of Paul's writings about women in the church, right? And Christians, well-intentioned Christians, fall into a variety of different categories there. But I don't know that I would say that anyone is not a Christian because they disagreed with me on whether or not a woman can be a pastor in a church. So there are areas where there is a little bit of freedom to choose. And regardless, no matter where we are, no matter what we're talking about, no matter whether someone agrees with us or disagrees with us, let's try and be a little bit charitable. certainly more charitable than it seems like most of the rest of the country has been in the last several years, right? Have a little bit of humility. Recognize that while you think that everything you think is right, that's why you think it, you might be wrong. And I'll say one thing, for better or for worse, probably for better, that's something that I think being trained as a scientist has taught me, is that science is kind of a long, long history of us getting better and better because we keep realizing we were wrong before, right? Like any scientist who is so confident in their theory that they can't believe it could be wrong is not doing a good job of being a scientist. You should always be second guessing yourself. And so I think there's a little bit of humility that comes whether you want it or not with training in the sciences. So, okay, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, in all things, charity. So, there is a debate about how old the universe we live in is. And there are two camps here, right? There is the scientific consensus. There's a pretty much uniform, without exception, scientific consensus that our universe is billions and billions of years old, which is at odds with what is often called the YEC, the young Earth creationist view, that our universe is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. For what it's worth, and you in the room right now, you might fall into either of these camps. And it is not my job here tonight to try and convince you of one or the other. But I will say that there is virtually no scientific evidence that can stand up and support the premise that our universe is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And I do believe that our universe is billions and billions of years old. I don't believe that how old you think the universe is a matter of whether or not you are saved. So I'll say that right up front, right? So that we can all still be friends. And I will also say this. The idea that the universe is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old is actually, and many people in our country don't realize this, a uniquely American idea. This is not something that you tend to find in Christians in any other country. And it relies on a very particular way of interpreting the passages in Genesis 1 through 11. And I'm trying to figure out how much I want to dive into this right now. Suffice to say, there are people who have spent their entire life studying the Bible, studying Hebrew, and doing their very best to do hermeneutics and exegesis and best determine how we should be reading the words that were written in Genesis 1 through 11. I am not one of those people. I spent a lot of time studying physics, and I spent some time studying the Bible, but certainly not my entire life. But I will say this, there was a great quote. Do I have this in my notes? Who said it? I can't remember who said it. But there's a great quote that the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. We were not the original audience for whom those words were intended. And so the Bible is not a science textbook. Nobody was doing astrophysics 3,000 years ago. Question?
Has anybody figured out when mankind, like how old mankind is? In other words, you said 20 million years, or it could be the dinosaurs, but when mankind...
Yeah, when did human beings, as we kind of think of human beings, appear on the scene? And so I got to be careful because we're moving outside my field of expertise. Yes, Adam and Eve, right? But like, when was that? And I believe a lot of modern science estimates are somewhere between like 300,000 and 1 million years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I will say, so I'm getting ahead of myself. I will say that there actually is evidence now that does seem to suggest it's entirely possible that all human beings alive today do actually descend from an original couple of one man and one woman, which is pretty interesting. But let me step back really quick to the age of the universe. There's overwhelming scientific evidence that our universe is something like 13.7 billion years old, that our planet, Earth, is something like 4.5 billion years old, and that there's been life on this planet for over 1 billion years, even if humans didn't show up until much later along the scene. Is that in contradiction to Genesis 1 through 11? I don't believe it is. There are quite a few biblical scholars who say that the reading of Genesis 1 to 11 is high poetry, what they might call high poetry. That it is true in the sense that it is telling you things that are true. What it is revealing are important facts about what God did. But that it was never the intention of those passages to explain why or when he did it. that it's beautiful language that has a very important lesson. All of everything is God's creation. But as far as the order in which fish and birds and people showed up, that's not what you're supposed to be taking away from that. And there are people much smarter than me who have said that that is an acceptable way to interpret those passages, and I'll take their word for it. Yeah.
But the calendar and the before BC and AD.
Yeah.
See, that's in there somewhere.
In where?
In the mix of when humanity was.
So yes, I mean, so it is that
So
to this day we still use BC and AD, right? Which is based off of Christ, though. So this is a dating of the New Testament. So everything in the Old Testament is BC, right, before Christ,
Right.
and we don't necessarily have
We
good
don't know
dates.
how yeah.
Right, we don't know how far back we need to go for these events. Right, you can try and do some actual math and do math backwards and get to how long ago was Adam's life. But I think that is not the intention of the passages in Genesis that refer to the lifetimes of human beings and the descendants. The intention was not to tell you exactly when Adam lived. The intention was to tell you that Adam lived. He was the first man made in the image of God. He was God's creation. Right? These are the important takeaways, and the timing of it is not really what we need to be quibbling over. So, in the absence of the Bible giving us a hard and fast date for Adam's life, I will happily turn to science and see if we can't do our best to figure some of these things out. Because I don't believe that these things are in conflict. I believe they can be used together. So how old is our universe? Well, it appears as if it's billions of years old, best we can tell. Is that a problem? Not for me. God created it. And then it sat there for a while. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that a little bit ridiculous? You're saying the universe is 13.7 billion years old, and so for the first 99.99% of it, it was just sitting there with no people in it? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Isn't that a waste of time? What do you mean by time? We're talking about God here. Right? Let me tell you an old joke. A reporter goes and gets to interview God. Asks him all these questions, including, God, is it true that $1 million is just like a penny to you? God says, yeah, no big deal. Is it true that 1,000 years is like a second to you? Yeah, no big deal. Lots of other questions. Very into the interview, the reporter says, hey, God, can I have a penny? And God says, yeah, just 1 second. What might seem as some kind of colossal waste of time to us is not at all a colossal waste of time to God. Right? God has all the time in the world, as it were, to set his plans into action. So the age of the universe, this can be a sticking point for Christians and scientists. If you stick hard and fast to you must believe that the universe is 6,000 years old, then you are going to be in disagreement with most of modern science. And that leads then to some unfortunate possible resolutions, right? Either you have to just disregard science and believe that scientists are either wrong or actually malicious out to destroy faith, or you have to abandon your faith. And this is my concern with young earth creationism, is that if we raise up children who believe this so strongly that it is a required tenet of their faith, and they go out and they start learning science and taking science classes and finding just these enormous amounts of evidence that the universe is much, much older than that, they're going to have a little crisis of faith. And that to me is heartbreaking. So that one, as a Christian, I guess I would say I'm fine with you believing either, but I think that it can do damage to insist on this one particular interpretation that is not by any means the only interpretation, right? And I'll say this again, here's another thing that I have come to realize, is that I absolutely do believe that the Bible is the inerrant, infallible Word of God. I do not believe that Kyle is inerrant and infallible. And again, this comes back to this idea of, a little bit of humility can go a long way. We should all, as Christians, believe that the Bible is 100% true. But we should also realize that it doesn't mean that we are 100% accurate when we do our best to interpret it. It's good to do your best, but have that little bit of humility that you might be wrong, even if the Bible is right. This is another one that gets maybe even hairier. Evolution. So again, there is a pretty much uniform scientific consensus among biological scientists that evolution is the source of the abundance of life on this planet. There is very little that is available from the scientific community to disagree with that or to deter that fact. And in light of that, we need to try and figure out, how do we deal with that as Christians? And I mentioned earlier on this organization BioLogos that I'm a big fan of. Big organization of scientists who are also Christians in the scientific fields. And it might come as a shock to some of you to learn that essentially all of the scientists in BioLogos believe in evolution. They have no problem with evolution. They believe that life arose on this planet as single-celled organisms, and that everything that we see today evolved from that, and that this was God's plan all along. This was God's intention. This was God's creation. And I would say that, honestly, that's the direction I lean. I got to be careful, because now we're moving outside of my area of expertise. Physics and astrophysics is my realm, but biology is something that I have studied much less. But I will say this, and this is something that I've thought long and hard on, is that, again, we come to this idea that the intention of Genesis 1 through 11 is to show you that God is the one who created everything in the universe. But its intention is not to show you how he created it. Is there anything wrong with evolution being God's intended plan for how he gets all the species on this planet? Does that detract from God's creative powers or his ability in any way? I think no. In fact, if anything, I think it's the opposite. And here's a strange analogy that I've tried to use before. Let me see if this sticks with you all. Imagine you want to construct something out of Legos. You got a big room filled with a whole bunch of Legos. So imagine two different ways of going about constructing some beautiful, gorgeous contraption out of Legos. You could walk into the room and you could build it out of Legos. All right, that's the first way. Here's the much weirder second way. You could actually design the room so that you can just throw the Legos into it and they just land haphazardly all over the room. And then you shut the door and you leave. And you've built the room in such a way that it kind of like shakes a little bit to the right and bounces a little bit up and down every now and then. And it shakes, bounces, and moves so that over the course of several years, inside, because you've designed the room just perfectly, the Legos bounce onto each other and form a contraption. You guys with me so far? Which of these two ways of building something out of Legos is more impressive to you? Because to me, it's definitely that second one. That God could design a universe with all these beautiful, elegant laws built in, and he could give it that little tiny kickstart here on planet Earth, such that then he could step back and watch his work do what it was supposed to do. Does that detract from God's creativity? Does that detract from God's omnipotence? I don't think it does at all. And I have been convinced, I was not necessarily in this camp originally, but I have been convinced that there is no reason that you can't be a devout Christian, trusting in the inerrancy of the Bible, and also actually believe in evolution. If that comes as a bit shocking, I apologize, but that is what I wanted to say. Yeah?
And how do you believe in irreducible complexity?
Yeah, so,
by shaking the room.
Yeah, so there is an argument against evolution called irreducible complexity. The idea that there exist in some biological organisms contraptions or organs or elements that if you take out any single part of them, they don't do what they were supposed to do anymore. And this is, it's an old argument that's been used for a while, but biologists have actually managed to find a solution to that. That almost all of the examples of irreducible complexity that we thought were irreducible complexity, you actually can build step by step. So things like
Michael B. he would disagree with you.
Is that, yeah, so I don't know what particular examples might still persist, but the classic one was the human eye.
Flagellum?
The flagellum, that we know can come from cilia, which is a precursor to flagellum. And that can come from just there are debates that can happen here, certainly. And again, I should be careful, because again, biology is not my particular field. I will say that my brother, Cody Waters, also grew up roaming these halls, causing trouble. Troublesome duo. He actually is a biology professor at Sac State, so this is his field, and he knows a lot more about this stuff than I do. But the understanding that I have is that most of the examples of irreducible complexity have actually been solved in the sense that we can imagine a series of steps that would get you there. Not all of them. But this also leads to another thing. So there's something called the God of the Gaps argument, which is a very dangerous path to take as a Christian. And it goes like this. You find something in science that no scientist can explain, and you say, haha, see science? God did that. I don't recommend this because a couple of years down the road, scientists might figure out how to explain the thing they couldn't explain before. And now your supernatural explanation, God did that, isn't required anymore. So we got to be careful when we make arguments in that particular vein. And again, I will take my own advice and have a little grain of humility. I am not absolutely positive that evolution from single-celled organisms to what we see today is in fact what happened. That's my current supposition. It works the best from what I have learned. And I will say this, at the very least, there is to me very clearly a way for believing in evolution and still being a Christian to coexist. And you don't have to take my word for it. There are scores of people who fall into this same category. And again, this is a little bit weird. It's significantly more common outside of the United States. It's interesting, kind of a uniquely American phenomenon that we see evolution and Christian faith as being in opposition to one another. It's not something that's universal. So far, so good? We're coming up at like 5 minutes to 7 o'clock, so let's do one last slide. What does science and faith look like for me? And this one, I didn't edit this. I think this is actually, you know what I think this is? I stole this straight off of a job application for Westmont College from several years ago. I would have loved to go back to my alma mater and teach, but I would not have loved leaving Sacramento. It's a good city we have here, but I did think about it. I may have submitted a job application years ago. I hate reading off of a slide, but I want to read this to you. So. As a Christian, I am called to share my faith. I believe that. To be salt and light and to make disciples of all nations. As a physics professor, right, my occupation, I'm responsible for the education of my students, for helping them grasp the workings of the world around them and even the universe beyond the world around them. But as a Christian physics professor, I get to do both of these at the same time, as often as I can, right? To reveal to my students the wonders of God's creation, even if I don't get to call it God's creation out loud at Sac State. From the subatomic scale to the megaparsec scale. Megaparsec is big, by the way. More than this. I'm called to remove any wedge that may have been placed between science and faith. I'm called to strengthen faith by showing what God has done for us, and to strengthen understanding by revealing the ways in which He has done it. I'll say this, it is not uncommon for a student, upon learning that I'm a Christian, which is a fact that I don't hide, I try to make that clear in my classes. It's not uncommon for a student, upon learning that I'm a Christian, to come to me after class. Say, how can you be a science professor and also be a Christian? And I'll tell them some of the things that I've told you tonight. I'll talk about the more that I study the universe we live in, the more I see the fingerprint of God on His creation. And more often than not, that conversation ends with the student saying something like, I guess that actually kind of makes a lot of sense. I will admit, I have never got to like stop, sit there, and pray with a student as they accept Christ. I have not had that experience yet. I hope that one day I get to have that. But at the very least, I hope that a door has been opened a crack a bit to some of these students. To realize that to be a person of science, to be a person whose faith is important to them, does not require you to be two different people. Does not require cognitive dissonance. Doesn't require splitting your brain in half and having my church brain that I use on Sunday and my science brain that I use during the week. That these two things can go together very well. And that our faith leads us to believe that science is a worthwhile pursuit. There was a brilliant creative God who made this universe. Let's go learn about it. And that our science strengthens our faith. This creation that we live in is beautiful and amazing. I need to just stop and give glory to the God who made it. And that these two things support one another and make each of them stronger than they would have been on their own. And with that, I'll stop and pause and we can take more questions.
Yeah. So, do you believe that when we have a scientific advancement, discovery, that is science? We're learning the rules have always been there? Or it's divine intervention, God revealing it to us?
That's a great question. And
Kyle,
yeah.
What was the question?
Yeah, so let me repeat the question. When there is some kind of amazing scientific breakthrough, is that really just science, us discovering something that had always been there and been there all along? Or is that like a divine intervention of God revealing something to us? And to that, I might kind of glibly respond, well, why can't it be both? I do believe that what we are discovering with these breakthroughs is something that has always been true. I think God has given us this amazing cosmos that, like I was saying, has order to it. There are laws that govern the way the universe works. Some of these laws are trickier than others to figure out. I also like to, one of the jokes I make is that as an astrophysicist, I have very good job security. Because we are nowhere near figuring it all out yet. The more we explore, the more we discover, the more we learn, the more we find new questions that don't have answers yet. And so I do believe that when we make these scientific breakthroughs, we're learning something that had always been true, we just hadn't realized it yet. But that doesn't mean that this wasn't an act of kind of, divine inspiration that helped us make that last little leap to figure out how something works or why something works the way it does.
So I was thinking about your argument when you say, aha, so you can't explain it, that's God. So, and then, but you said be careful because in the future, you
If
may
they end
be
up
able
being able to explain it.
But that can be God as well.
Yes, right, yeah. So yeah, you gotta be, like, what do you mean when you say that's God, right? Yeah, the fact that we eventually figure it out is, it's not just maybe attributable to God, it's definitely attributable to God, because the only reason we figure anything out is because of these amazing brains that he gave us. The ability to actually pursue the sciences is a God-given gift, right? We are the only of his creatures that were made in his image, right? The existence of our indwelt soul, and also this kind of creative curiosity to explore the world around us, I think is a beautiful gift of God that he has given us, and one that I would encourage anyone to partake in a little bit more. Yeah?
As an astrophysicist, how do you explain the argument of multiverse versus universe?
Yeah, so you know what's funny? So the question was, how do I deal with the multiverse? I was actually just talking about the multiverse in class just a few hours ago. And the multiverse, the idea of the multiverse is that we live in the universe, what we call the universe, but it's actually just our universe, and that there are, in fact, many, many other universes out there. This is an admittedly interesting idea, but I would actually argue that it is not scientific, because it's not testable. It's an interesting idea. We have no idea whether or not it's true. Let me be crystal clear. The multiverse is not an actual, established scientific theory. That we have no idea whether or not it's true. We have no evidence for it at all. We don't have any evidence against it, and we're not ever going to get any of either kind, because we're stuck in this universe. We can't explore other universes. Are there other universes out there? I don't know. Could there be? I guess. I have no reason to say God couldn't have made another universe where he's doing some other cool stuff over there. But I don't know if that's true or not, and I have no way of finding out. So multiverse theory is something that I, as a scientist, am perfectly happy to basically just ignore. Because there's no reason for us to believe that there is a multiverse, and there's no way for us to test whether or not there is. It is something that many atheists have to fall back on because of the fine-tuning thing I was talking about, right? The fact that our universe seems so amazingly perfectly tuned for life is very, very difficult for you to deal with if you don't believe in a creator. But there is a way you can say, oh, okay, so here's the thing. There's actually trillions and trillions of universes, and most of them are totally inhospitable to life, as you would expect, and we just happen to be living in the one that's nice. And that's how you deal with fine-tuning. Okay, I guess. But there's no way you can ever actually test that scientifically. So I'm not a big fan of the multiverse theory. Yeah, so I'm fine just kind of pushing it to the side. Let's work with the one we actually are in. Yeah.
Can you explain why they call the Higgs boson the God particle?
Oh, that's a good question. So this is the question was, can I explain why the Higgs boson, the most recently discovered fundamental particle, has been nicknamed the God particle? This is a very unfortunate nickname. And it's one that basically you won't ever actually hear out of a scientist's mouth. And not because scientists are anti-God, because it's not a great name. It's unfortunate that it kind of stuck and hung around. The original reason goes something like this. The Higgs boson is a particle with, first of all, funny name, boson. It's just fun to say out loud. But the Higgs boson creates what's called the Higgs field, which gives mass to every other particle. this is some really like weird high-level particle physics stuff, but like the reason that other particles have mass at all is because of the Higgs boson. And so we always suspected or knew that something like it needed to exist, even if we hadn't discovered it yet. And this is kind of a funny thing. Like the Higgs boson, this big announcement back, like 10, 15 years ago when it finally got discovered over at CERN at the Large Hadron Collider, giant, super collider underground in Switzerland and France. They finally discovered it after decades of searching. Or like, we knew it needed to be there, we just were having trouble finding it. That's a massive oversimplification of people's entire life work, but so this particle, it imbues mass to all the other particles. And so it is, in a way, kind of like giving the existence to all of the other particles that make up the universe. And so in that sense, it's almost, it's like the way that God gives existence to all of the universe. And so it's a stretch. I don't like it as a nickname, but for better or for worse, it's stuck around and people like to use it. But that's kind of, that was the reason why, was that it kind of like acted in a way, in some small analogous way, like God for the particles of the universe, that it gave mass to all the other particles, just like God gave creation to all of the universe. That's a quick explanation. Yeah, Ron.
Given the fact that we all see the evidence of evolution, and you bring up quite rightly the fact, well, God can use evolution to create, so there's no problem there. But then we read in Genesis that we have the impression that God created man in just less than a week or a day. So there's that big discrepancy between evolution and millions of years and the creation in a few days.
Yeah, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
How do we deal with what we read in Genesis 1 and 2, that it was basically a week from the beginning of the universe to human beings showing up? And the answer is what I kind of touched on earlier, that what we are reading there in Genesis 1 is not intending to give us a timeline, it's intending to give us an outline, right? It's there to tell us what God created, right? Or if I could change my words a little bit, it's there to tell us what was created and who was the creator. But the durations there are not actually something we're supposed to be holding that hard and fast to. I mean, so there's an interesting point that's made, right, is that we read in Genesis 1, like, there was day and there was night the second day. But that happens before there's actually a sun in the sky. So how do you even have a day and a night? Like, we're not supposed to be reading this as a science textbook. That was not the intention of the author of Genesis, right? The people receiving that originally never would have, right, in 1,000 years, imagined that they were supposed to read this as like a recipe, right? A cookbook for how to make the universe. That's not what it's for. It's there to tell you that God is the one who made everything. It reveals God's sovereignty over everything. There is nothing in the universe over which God is not sovereign. That God is the creator of all that is. And so the important takeaways are not necessarily the ones that we sometimes spend the most time bickering about. Yeah. Anthony.
Hey. I know that somewhere in your talk you mentioned that there is evidence that we as a human race came from an original 2 members. And so also looking at evolution, where, we would supposedly come from the primate family, and there being so many different variations of the primate family, how do you eventually reconcile it down to a specific moment of 2 human beings out of a whole primate family, that this is when God specifically was like, these are my chosen people? And then what are these other primates? Or are they failed creations of his? That he thought about me?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I definitely wouldn't use the word failed for anything that God did.
Different. Beta test.
But no, yeah. So let me say this. So and this is definitely something that I've spent time thinking about, and I'll give you kind of my current hypothesis. Like if I'm pushed, as I just have been by Mr. Wing over here. So what did it actually look like, right? So if I'm here saying that I think evolution actually is true, but I also believe that God made us in His image, how is that possible? And my idea involves a supernatural intervention, right? So that God set things up, and the laws of nature, right, did His work. But the laws of nature cannot give something a soul, right? The laws of nature cannot make something have God's image. And so if I had to guess how it went, okay, so I think, you've got evolution, and you've got these primates, and eventually you get to a point where you've got something that looks enough like a human being that God looks down and says, great, they're ready, right? Like my awesome evolution thing has done its job, and I've got these shells, right? These biology shells that I'm going to then do my work with. And then God does basically what we read in Genesis 1, right? He breathes his spirit into them. But instead of it being literal mud, as we read in Genesis, maybe what that mud meant was, right, what God had created for himself. Because God made the mud in Genesis 1. But what if that mud was, the evolutionary processes that led us up to these very, very early humans, right? They looked like a human, but they didn't yet have a soul. They weren't truly made in the image of God. And then God comes in, right, and he goes, boop, boop. Right, the first one was Adam, the second one was Eve. And he instills a soul into two of these formerly, right, hominids, and now human beings, the first human beings. And so then, and it's actually, for what it's worth, this does solve some other weird questions that have arisen that can be difficult to answer, because we read in Genesis, right, that after Cain kills Abel, he goes off to some other village, and he ends up marrying and having children. And there's, there's a question, a long-standing question in Christian theology of like, who were these other people? Like, where did they come from? Like, did you just skip over Adam and Eve having a bunch of other kids? You didn't talk about them? You just focused on Cain and Abel? So there's, a possible solution to that is that Cain went with the other non-human hominid. Biologically, there would have been things that looked a lot like him, but they were not instilled in the image of God. They didn't have a soul. And so I don't know. And again, I am completely spitballing here right now. This is me, layperson, non-biologist, doing my best to come up with a story that at least is coherent and intelligible. I am not saying that this is the way God did it. I am saying this is the way he could have done it. I don't know, right? And so, this is a good chance for me to say one other thing. Like, let's not put God in a box of our making. Let's not, on our own, decide what God could have and could not have done. Let's take that little ounce of humility and respect the fact that God's bigger than we are, and that if we actually can't ever figure out how he did something, that shouldn't be a problem. In fact, if you can figure out everything about God, that's not really any God that I want to worship. Right? If you can fully understand God, that's not a very impressive God. So the fact that we will be left with questions eventually, inevitably, I think, is something that actually, if I'm being honest, it took me a while to get to being okay with what I just said. Because, as a curious little scientist, I wanted answers for everything. I am not okay, even to this day, right? It frustrates me that I don't get, all of the answers I want. But I have, I think, finally, in the wisdom of my old age, come to terms, thank you for laughing. Come to terms with this idea that there will be things that I don't get answers to in this life, right? And I guess I should have just, read Job a while ago and I would have realized that sooner. But, I can't make a big fish. So I'm just going to deal with the fact that there are things that God has done that I may not ever understand on this side of heaven. I do look forward to getting all the answers in eternity, because we will have the mind of Christ. Oh, can't wait. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Yeah.
Getting away from evolutionary theory.
Yeah.
And back into your realm.
Thank you.
So we have a new tool, the James Webb Space Telescope.
Yes, we do.
And what sort of things are we seeing that are new and interesting and exciting in what we are seeing and how that might play into faith?
So, a couple different questions there, and I'll do a couple different answers. So, the James Webb Space Telescope is an amazing, fantastic accomplishment of science and engineering. Right? It's like, I would imagine most of you have heard of the Hubble Space Telescope. Webb is like Hubble 2.0, Hubble on steroids. Significantly more capable of doing all kinds of amazing feats of science. And one of the things that it is very, very good at is looking farther away in the universe than we have ever looked before. It has already broken the record for farthest away galaxy ever found, and then broken its own record again, and then broken that record again. The record, which has been standing for like years, was broken like 3 times in like 2 months. By Webb, and then by Webb again, and then by Webb again. And so we're peering into like the far, far reaches of the universe. Which also means that we're peering back to the beginning of the universe. As a quick little astrophysics lesson. The speed of light is fast, but it's not infinitely fast. The farther away something is, the longer it takes for the light from that object to get to us. And so the farther away you look in the universe, the farther back in time you are looking. If this sounds creepy and weird, I don't blame you, but it is 100% true. When we look at a galaxy 100 million light years away, we're not actually seeing what that galaxy looks like. We're seeing what that galaxy looked like 100 million years ago. And with James Webb, we are peering back to the very, very earliest galaxies in the universe. And they're not what we expected. Guess what? Turns out we were wrong. Scientists are good at being wrong. But as long as we're also good at admitting we were wrong, then we're on the right track. So we had these ideas about how galaxies form and how fast they form. And so we expected to find these like itty bitty tiny little like baby galaxies basically back at the beginning of the universe. And Webb finally has allowed us to peer way back to the beginning of the universe. And we're finding all these like ornery, angsty teenage galaxies. Right? They're already in their kind of like post-pubescent phase. They're not babies. They're not as big as what we have today, but they're way bigger than like any scientist thought that they should be. And so now we're like, well, this is exciting. Time for us to rethink some things, because we were clearly wrong about something. And so as we build bigger and better pieces of hardware, we can discover new things. And what tends to happen when you discover new things is you find out you were wrong. Sometimes we're right, not always. And so this is right. I mean, how does this kind of work into my faith as well? Well, I think the more that we explore the universe, the more we find these amazing, beautiful things, the more we realize that God's creation is intricate and complex and elegant in ways that we never knew before. And so here's one more specific James Webb example. James Webb Space Telescope has the ability to utilize infrared light instead of regular, what we would call visible light. The light that we see with our eyes is not actually the light that James Webb picks up. And this allows for something fascinating. Because it turns out that our universe, and our galaxy especially, is filled with giant clouds of gas and dust all throughout the galaxy. And these big clouds of gas and dust do a really good job of blocking our view. You can't see what's beyond them or even what's inside of them. And we know that stars are born in big giant clouds of gas and dust. You know that stars are born and live and die? It's true. It's cool. It's awesome. And stars are born out of these big giant clouds of gas and dust, but they're not see-through unless you use infrared light. The James Webb Space Telescope uses infrared light almost like a form of X-ray vision. Visible light, the light that our eyes see, the light that regular telescopes see, the light that Hubble sees is blocked, and you can't see into the clouds or beyond them. But the infrared eyes of James Webb can peer right through the dust and reveal what's inside. And so there are these stunning, gorgeous images that are not of newly discovered objects. James Webb is becoming famous for taking pictures of things we've already been looking at and admiring for decades, but revealing these amazing things inside that we didn't know were there before. And so even the stuff we think we know is hiding more. And I mean, how's that for a story of our faith walk, right? Every time you go back and you read a story from the Bible, or you can read a story from the Bible 15 times and find something new every single time. God has the ability to hide beautiful truths right in front of our eyes that we might miss first, second, third, fourth, 18th time. But when we eventually look with our heart in the right, kind of place, or when we look with infrared light instead of visible light, we find something that we didn't see before. And so James Webb is fantastic for science, fantastic for kind of talking about science with people. And if I'm able to make a little stretch, helps reinforce some really important spiritual truths as well.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Okay.
One more. All right. So this is Ann says last one.
Okay, sorry. So if we can see teenage galaxies, then the next version of James Webb, are we anticipating that we can see back to the Big Bang? And is that the ultimate goal of astrophysics?
That's a very good question. That would be a wonderful goal, but it's not anybody's goal because we can't. And I don't mean we can't because we don't have good enough telescopes. The laws of physics actually prevent us from seeing back to the Big Bang. The very early universe was opaque to all forms of radiation. There's a sentence for you. Opaque to all forms of radiation. It means it wasn't see-through for any kind of light. And so there's this giant wall about 300,000 years after the Big Bang that we can't see past. And again, when I say can't, I don't mean our current technology prohibits us. I mean the laws of physics prohibit us. which is all. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. It's almost like God was saying like, you don't get to see this one.
Well, God's on the other side waving at us.
Yeah, right. We're doing one of these. So there is an actual hard and fast limit from the laws of physics themselves to how far back in time we can look. Now, to be fair, stars didn't form before that time, so we might. So this is what is kind of a holy grail of astrophysics: is could we look back far enough to see the first stars forming? That would be absurdly difficult, but not impossible, and something that I'm sure scientists will be trying to do in the years to come. These were great questions. Let me say one final time, thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure. Andy, you have some last words?
All I was going to say is I just want to pray for us before we
Yes,
leave
please.
this evening. Gracious God, thank you for bringing us all here and bringing Kyle here this evening. How grateful we are. What a wonderful picture of your creation. Thank you, Lord. We love you, and we're so delighted to hear more. We just pray your blessing on all the people that are here and on Kyle, and take us home safely. And we just give you all the glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, where is it? This guy. A bit of a trek.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.